Survived the rigors of an attempt to get on Eastern Airlines from Washington to Boston, which included an hour-and-a-half delay, unfortunately, at the National Airport and another hour's delay here in Boston. We're very pleased to welcome tonight to Harvard Jim Baker, the Secretary of the Treasury. Not many people go through quite that level of ordeal getting here, but we're pleased that he arrived in any case. Our speaker tonight's favorite leisure activity is turkey shooting. Really, turkey shooting, and not only in Washington. Success in this sport requires great patience, combined with timing and decisiveness. The gentleman we welcome tonight has been known to sit silently for 8 hours in a blind, awaiting the moment of action. And he's been heard to comment that the hard part of the sport is not shooting, but getting in the position to shoot. Whether this is the secret of his success in Washington, I can't say. But my inside sources tell me that he shot 2 turkeys last fall, and that even though the official limit is just 1 wild turkey in the spring, he somehow got 2 this spring as well. That being the case, who would bet against a tax bill at this point? Though it still seems somewhat premature to suggest that the international debt problem is somehow in the bag. Secretary of Treasury Baker was born in Houston, Texas in 1930. He graduated from Princeton in 1952 and received his J.D. from the University of Texas. A Democrat until 1970, Jim was recruited by his longtime friend and tennis partner, George Bush, when Bush decided to run in a Senate campaign in Texas, which he lost. Bush, you'll recall, is President Reagan's vice president. He's also here in Boston tonight. Many citizens of the Commonwealth will recall George's visit to China in 1983. Asked by his Chinese hosts whether this was his first visit to a communist country, Bush replied, "Why, no, I visited Massachusetts last year." In any case, Jim went on to serve as campaign manager in Texas in 1982, as chairman of the Ford campaign in 1976. He ran the Bush presidential campaign in 1979, masterminding the upset victory in the Iowa caucuses. And after Bush withdrew from the race, he joined the Reagan camp. Among the biggest surprises in the new administration was Reagan's appointment of Baker as chief of staff. His Ford and Bush roots made him suspect among some of the more ideological members of the administration. But President Reagan found irresistible his capacity to get the job done. He therefore immediately became one of the Troika, developing and managing the strategy of the Reagan Revolution. As the New York Times described the Troika, behind the scenes, Meese, Baker, and Deaver have been the nerve center of the new administration, orchestrating the Reagan presidency, guiding the new cabinet and the entire Reagan entourage, screening all the key appointments, subtly influencing politics and policies, helping the president set the tone. When Jim Baker and Don Regan switched jobs at the beginning of the second term, many people speculated that Baker had somehow been pushed out of the White House. Conservative columnists in particular cheered. As Howard Phillips' Conservative Digest had written of Baker, quote, "Baker's group calls the plays and Reagan runs with the ball. Baker only understands negotiating and compromise. What he is doing is destroying Reagan's reputation for integrity and principle," close quote. Evans and Novak claimed that with the banishment of the pragmatist who had blunted the Reagan Revolution, Reagan could finally be Reagan. They proved wrong on both counts. Reagan's pragmatism proved deeper than conservative cheerleaders thought. What was worse, from their point of view, under Jim Baker's leadership, the Department of the Treasury emerged as a major actor both on the domestic and on the international financial scenes. On tax reform, the international debt problem, the international monetary system, the value of the dollar, and even U.S. cooperation with foreign governments, under Jim Baker's leadership, the U.S. Treasury restored a sense of American leadership and dynamism. A former faculty member here at the school, Dick Darman, summarizes Jim Baker's major claim to fame of relevance here by focusing on the way in which he combines substantive sense on the one hand and political. Issue around in 30 days and won it. A bipartisan Social Security resolution, which the Washington pundits gave no chance, sailed through both houses under his guidance unscathed. And while the game ain't over till it's over, the tax reform bill so many people have been betting against, which has been nurtured and guided from its outside by Baker, now seems to become likely to be a reality. So to speak to us tonight on the subject of making a strong presidency, please join me in welcoming Jim Baker.
Thank you very, very much, Dean Allison, for that very kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be with you this evening. I'm also gratified. Training so that he might go to Washington to oversee the world's largest budget and then make $2.5 million as an author. I rather suspect that many of you here tonight who are taking courses or participating in a degree program at the Kennedy School are already aspiring to public service. That is a very, very noble goal. I must confess that I did not always share that commitment. For the first 22 years or so after I graduated from law school from the University of Texas, I was very busy trying to make it in the competitive atmosphere of a major Houston law firm, and I was too busy for public policy. And somehow, anyway, politics had sort of a dirty connotation, and really good lawyers didn't involve themselves in politics. But I was a pretty good griper and moaner about what was wrong with this country, and about what was wrong with my state of Texas. One day my wife said to me, she said, you know, you really have no grounds to complain because you're not willing to roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty and do something about what you think is wrong. And I thought about that, and I concluded that she was right. And one thing led to another, and one day I found myself running for statewide office, only time I ever tried it, running for statewide office in the state of Texas, back in the days when Texas hadn't elected a Republican statewide since Reconstruction. We'd elected one in a special election. But nevertheless, there I was out there telling the people how important it was to get involved and to be concerned if you wanted to make a difference. And I never will forget one hot summer afternoon in a bar in Amarillo, Texas. And you might say, what in the world were you doing in a bar? And the answer to that is, if you were a Republican running in Texas in those days, you would talk to anybody who would listen. And I found a few people who would listen in that bar, and I really was laying into them, and I concluded my speech by saying that the two foremost problems facing the state of Texas that day were ignorance and apathy. And I leaned over and I said, "What do you think about that, sir?" And this grizzled old rancher sitting there, he looked over his beer, and he looked up at me, and he said, "Well, now I'll tell you, Sonny." He said, "I don't know, and I don't care." I probably ought to stop there, but being from Texas, I want to just mention one other anecdote to you about the graduate from Texas A&M University who came up here to take a graduate course. And his first day on the campus, he was walking around and he ran into a Harvard graduate and he said, "Could you please tell me where the library's at?" And this Harvard graduate said, "You rube," he said, "you'll never make it up here." He said, "You've got to learn that we never end a sentence with a preposition." I said, "Oh, I understand." He said, "Could you tell me where the library's at, jackass?" Back to public service. In my own years in public service, I've been privileged to serve 2 U.S. presidents, and so I've had the opportunity to observe the modern American presidency at rather close range and to develop some opinions about that office that I'd like to share with you tonight. In doing so, I'll touch on what I think are some of the elements necessary for the making of a strong presidency and why the strength of this political institution is so very, very important to all of us as Americans. One of the keenest observers of the presidency, and a man that I count myself fortunate enough to have gotten to know very, very well through 3 presidential campaigns, was Teddy White. Teddy was a son of Massachusetts, and he was a son of Harvard. And I know all of us are going to miss him, and miss him tremendously. In The Making of the President in 1960, the first of 5 books which Teddy wrote on America's electoral process, his concluding chapter reflects on an interview with the new young president about the unique requirements of the office of the presidency. "The essence of leadership," wrote White, "is whether the president is moved by other people and outer forces, or whether he himself moves them." He added, "A president governing the United States can move events only if he can first persuade." The inauguration of John F. Kennedy seemed to initiate, I think, a new era for the American presidency and initiate, in effect, a new era for the nation. We were at peace, we were relatively prosperous, yet he emerged on the national scene determined to provide vigorous national leadership to confront our problems. At the very same time, another force that would have a profound effect on the institution of the presidency also came on the political stage. In fact, that other force would come more and more to shape the script and the actors of governance, and that other force was television. When Kennedy campaigned in the early primaries, the pencil press that followed him was sometimes joined by a cumbersome network quartet of producer, reporter, sound man, and cameraman, the curiously new participants on the campaign trail. That same year, television also played a key role in the advent of 20th century mass democracy, the first of the televised political debates. With their phenomenally high ratings, these contests, I think it can be fairly said, gave the more skillful communicator Kennedy a boost that carried him to victory a few weeks later. What struck Teddy White most about the first encounter was not Kennedy's response to any specific question, but the effectiveness with which he communicated his vision for the future. Once in office, he mastered the new medium by being the first president to allow his press conferences to be televised live, satisfying the thirst of the new medium for drama on the national scene. His performances seemed to cement Americans' impression of him as the president who would lead and who would offer movement to a nation with seemingly unbridled prospects for growth and for prosperity. Regrettably, of course, events overtook our national optimism. By 1968, White commented in his 3rd book on the presidential election process that President Johnson had left behind a tradition of distrust in leadership, a repudiation of the presidential capacity unmatched emotionally since the repudiation of Herbert Hoover. At the risk of oversimplifying, a credibility gap had taken hold of the Johnson presidency, engulfing his domestic and his foreign initiatives as well. His vision for a harmonious great society was cracked by discordant riots in our cities and by a new dissent on our campuses. His pronouncements that the Vietnam War was indeed going well were repudiated by the reality of an escalating conflict brought home to Americans by the medium of television. And reflecting all of this was that medium, television, which had become, White wrote, the primary vehicle for the new court of high criticism of the institution of the presidency. Many tests faced the next president: turmoil in the cities, social unrest, the war. But White thought Richard Nixon's real challenge would be to restore the confidence of millions of Americans who no longer trust any government of the United States. This would only happen, White predicted, if the new president could convey his vision of conciliation to the nation. But none of Nixon's accomplishments at home or offset the verdict of 2 summers of congressional hearings televised daily and nightly into America's homes. The office of the president had reached its lowest ebb in our history. From a time when we once revered the image of Camelot at the White House, imperial had become a pejorative when used to describe our highest elective office. President Ford, I think it's fair to say, restored confidence and trust in the office itself. But in the aftermath of Watergate, instead of turning to a strong presidency in the next election, we Americans opted for a different kind of presidency. The early Carter presidency was a time of national catharsis. He scorned the customary limousine. He walked with his family to the White House after his inauguration. When he greeted his first official audience at the White House, the ceremonial ruffles prejudice, and I know that there are probably members of the Carter administration here. I think that the perceived, and I emphasize the word perceived, failure of the Carter presidency, and conversely, perhaps the perceived success of Ronald Reagan's presidency, center on their different attitudes toward governance. President Carter's first 100 days certainly rivaled FDR's in the number of initiatives. He sent a massive and a far-reaching collection of complex legislation to Capitol Hill, including a tax cut bill, major budget revision, executive reorganization authority, establishment of a new energy department, and packages for welfare, labor, and Social Security reform, among others. Yet, with the possible exception of the energy plan, there was really no central focal point for his presidency to rally around. There was no public vision of what the priorities of that program were. A kind of legislative gridlock ensued on Capitol Hill, and few of President Carter's proposals were even moved to the floor for consideration. The President himself sent a couple of confusing signals to lawmakers. He abruptly withdrew the $50 personal rebate as a part of his tax cut package, without forewarning congressional leaders that he was going to do so, and without forewarning some in his own administration. That's easy to do. You can't forewarn everybody. There are a lot of people in government. But the bottom line was that Congress was overloaded, the public was confused, and the public sort of tuned out or tuned off. The failure to establish this agenda early on, I think, was perhaps a strategic mistake, but there were a few tactical ones as well. Much has been written about this president's perceived inability to negotiate effectively with the Congress. Some said he handled the Congress with the same detached coolness that he had accorded the Georgia state legislature when he was governor, and that he was less than a forceful communicator. One observer has written, Carter blew the trumpet, yelled charge, and then nothing. But perhaps the most fundamental flaw in the Carter presidency was the philosophical premise that the task of governing can be achieved with a technocratic approach to problem solving. This is the idea that every public policy issue can be resolved with a specific plan or a specific program, and that the activist president is the technocratic manager of a complex set of interrelated policies. Whatever appeal this may have to social scientists, I think it's of little help in the practical aspects of governing. As opposed to being seen as a leader with a vision, President Carter was somewhat diminished, I think, by his approach to governance. He himself correctly lamented the problem towards the end of his term in that famous Malaise speech. He said, "What you see in Washington is a system of governance incapable of action. Often you see paralysis and you see drift. The elements of this crisis can be seen in the contradiction between the objectives of President Carter's government by technocratic management and the forces which accompanied President Carter's rise to power. The powers of the presidency had been so degraded by the time that he took office that President Carter did not command the respect and the deference which we have normally accorded our presidents. And the reform impulse in the Congress, that is, the diffusion of power with the proliferation of subcommittees and the weakening of the congressional leadership structure, expanded the opportunities for interest groups with inimical goals to influence the lawmakers. As Teddy White observed, President Carter insisted on keeping all of his promises at once. That left him exposed to all those with leverage in the offices of congressmen elected to represent their interests. In response to this situation, a consensus, I think, among our elites began to develop that the structural design of government was inadequate to meet the tasks of modern-day governing. It was said that the president's personal and political resources were insufficient to overcome the fragmentation and disarray inherent in the American doctrine of separation of powers. President Carter's White House counsel argued while his chief was still in office that the formal institutional resources for executive leadership were so insufficient that the Carter presidency could not succeed. In parliamentary terms, one might say that under the United States Constitution, it is not now feasible to form a government, he wrote in Foreign Affairs magazine. Unfortunately, he said, no recent president has been able to get his programs through Congress in anything approaching coherent form. The United States, he suggested, needed to go to a parliamentary type of government to end this executive branch, legislative branch gridlock. This was not the first time that structural reform had been advised for or suggested for the institution of the presidency. Limiting the president to a single 6-year term was discussed at the Constitutional Convention and was proposed to the Congress as a constitutional amendment as early as 1826. Proponents have reintroduced this measure into Congress more than 100 times since then. And I think there's a bill up there right now suggesting the same thing. In doing so, they argue that the president should be released from the constraints of seeking re-election. More recently, we've heard that our problems are too big for partisan control of the executive branch and that some form of coalition government should be considered. I think we should question such proposals. When political institutions, like the presidency, maintain relatively popular support for nearly 200 years, we ought to assume that they're doing something right. The American public, I think, has shown little dissatisfaction with the existing constitutional limits on the presidency. By successfully completing 2 successive terms, Ronald Reagan has the opportunity not only to redefine the role of the presidency, of the president, but to reinvigorate the institution of the presidency as well. This will be, I think, assuming it's accomplished, one of his most important legacies to the nation. He has reversed the commentary that presidents were incapable of leading this country. I think the presidency is still what Theodore Roosevelt called it, a bully pulpit. Much has been said and written of Ronald Reagan's ability to gain support for his programs by his skill as an educator and by his skill as a mobilizer of public opinion. His televised speeches are firm, I would say, but not abrasive. You may disagree. Persuasive without being hostile. A powerful combination, I think, in our political culture. The president's been able to use his skills as a communicator to take maximum advantage of the powers of persuasion that Dick Neustadt has written about. When President Reagan came into office, the conventional wisdom was that it was very difficult for a president to maintain his power through television, and that over time, television would destroy him. After all, it had for a series or a succession of presidents. I think that view now is at least subject to some revision. In his first term, by carefully marshaling his appearances before key congressional votes, I think the president was able to maximize his leverage over the congressional agenda. And with each victory that he was able to achieve, the president enhanced his reputation as a strong leader and as a successful leader. Success breeds success. But having observed President Reagan interact with members of the House and Senate, I would place equal emphasis for his success upon what Dick Neustadt called the residual impressions of tenacity and skill that the president conveys to the Congress and to the rest of the Washington community. A president's high approval in public opinion polls is really no guarantee that he will be able to lead effectively if the elite opinion of his true abilities is really low. The political skills needed to persuade the Washington community are not always the ones that a president needs to use or uses to move public opinion generally. Strength, steady resolution, an inner compass, if you will, the ability to fight hard for one's policies without personalizing disagreements, and knowing when and how to compromise to achieve the most elements of one's objectives have, I think, all been critical to President Reagan's success. By revitalizing the presidency, Ronald Reagan has increased the likelihood of cooperation between the executive and legislative branches of government on public policy. The contest between the two branches of government is not a zero-sum game. The president's gain is simply not the Congress's loss, and vice versa. In fact, polling data suggests that the president's popularity and success are positively influencing public attitudes toward other branches and levels of government, including the Congress. I've seen this cooperation work firsthand. Dean Allison mentioned in his introduction the Social Security Compromise in 1983, which I think was sensible legislation and which diffused perhaps the most volatile political issue that exists in our society today, the issue of Social Security. And although it may be just a footnote now to protracted turmoil in Lebanon, I think that historians will favorably record the successful negotiations between the Congress and the President over the first use of the War Powers Act to deploy United States military forces. Fundamental tax reform might become another product of this cooperation. As we approach the 200th year of this Constitution of ours, we should remember, I think, that America's government at its best is based on the strength of her institutions. Calling forth our best is not only for presidents and lawmakers, but for scholars and students and Americans of all walks of life. 25 years ago, that was the message of the president for whom this school is named. The history of this university and its community kindles the honorable flame of duty and flame of service in all of us. Just north of this building, a brief walk from here, as you know, is the Memorial Church. Sons of Harvard who have fallen in battle for their country are memorialized there. And a short distance from that point, due west, is the Cambridge Common, where George Washington took command of the Continental Army and members of this community volunteered to join his ranks. In this city, at this university, we are constantly reminded that the Founding Fathers were men who dared to build a nation upon confidence and cooperation, not fear and disunity. At the conclusion of his memoirs, In Search of History, Teddy White wondered whether the old ideas that have made America a nation could stretch far enough to keep it one. I'm confident that he believed they would, and I agree. And as we continue with the challenges we face in the years ahead, I'm sure that our leaders and I'm sure that our institutions will prove equal to these tasks. Thank you all very, very much. Great.
Plan to help developing countries grow their way out of the debt crisis is still very much in its formative stage. And I find myself concerned about one key underlying assumption of the plan that I'd like to ask you about. I think in broad terms, the goals and methods are to be applauded. The problem, it seems to me, is the notion underlying the plan that all of the developing countries will eventually be able to fight their way out of the crisis while staying on market terms with the international banks. There is a premise of the strategy since the debt crisis emerged in 1982 that international loans by commercial banks will be repaid on market terms. I won't go on too long, but one of the implications of that is that as the banks have pulled out in the last couple of years, international agencies and the multilateral banking institutions have been putting in a lot of money while the banks have been pulling out money. In a sense, we are bailing out the banks just on the historical record of the last couple of years. Moreover, there are many countries that seem to me, at least, to be cracking under the crisis, such as Peru, where society is disintegrating before our eyes. Is it wise to proceed, therefore, on the assumption that commercial bank loans should be repaid solely on market terms, as opposed to granting debt relief both from the official agencies and the commercial banks?
Well, as you probably heard me testify, was it this week? I've testified twice. I guess it was last week, right after you, when you were before the Senate Finance Committee. And I had the opportunity to listen to at least the last part of your presentation. You might have had the opportunity to listen to all of mine, I don't know. But there has been some movement away, I think it's fair to say, from market rates. In the case of some of the bigger borrowers, the private banks have brought their lending down to margins that are very, very narrow over LIBOR and are not what they were when these loans were incurred, and what the market rates probably would be today if the banks were able to charge more. So there's been some movement in that direction. I think the critical fact, the key point that you have to be very careful about is what that will mean is, in a free market society such as ours, and in all the private lending in these international loans, of course, is free market lending, is that those countries that demand that call for unilateral imposition of a moratorium on repayment, that say if we don't adopt a confrontational approach, and say if we do not get below market money, we will not pay, they will find themselves cut off from access to the financial markets. That will mean all access, not just new loans in the form of, let's say, structural adjustment lending or balance of payments lending. It will mean trade credits as well. And it will mean, and I understand just from the discourse tonight that you're working with Bolivia, and you're an expert on Bolivia, and
sir. Howard Baker, thank you very much, and started to hang up. I said, no, no, no. And I said, Jim Baker. She said, yes, sir, I think Jim is his middle name or his nickname. I have Howard Baker on my list. So, of course, I gave her the obvious lecture on the difference, and she said, sir, I don't have any such name on my list. I will have to list you under other. But it just did make me...
Before you ask your question, may I just interject there?
issues. And if Senator Packwood hadn't done a Packwood, to use the current favorite verb in Washington, which means make a 180-degree turn on short notice, there certainly wouldn't be a tax bill of the sort we now see. It seems almost a fortuitous event. And I'm wondering, really, if this is consistent with a view of a very consistent view and a very tenacious view in the White House on a very basic issue.
Well, let me just say that the White House is going to go full bore for passage of this legislation. The President, as you may have seen, has already been out on a number of occasions and said that while there are things in the package that don't comport with what he had in his package, for instance, the elimination of the differential on capital gains, some of the IRA provision, nevertheless, overall, that there's a trade-off there, and overall it is a very fine piece of fundamental tax reform, and he wants to see it enacted speedily, and enacted as a package. He's already out there saying that, and he'll continue to do that, and of course he will be lobbying it personally with the senators as well. So I think you'll see I quite agree with you in terms of the metamorphosis that occurred. I think we went full circle, but I also don't believe, quite frankly, if we had not, it wasn't done on purpose, I'm not suggesting that, but if we hadn't done that, we never would have gotten to this point of fundamental tax reform with only two rates, a bill that's going to take 6 million Americans at or near the poverty line off the tax rolls, and mean that 80% of all Americans are going to have a top tax rate of 15% or below. If we hadn't gone through that exercise in Senate Finance Committee for 3 weeks particularly that was so embarrassing to them, I don't think they ever would have gotten there. But the President's going to go full bore for this bill.
Could I ask you just in that regard, it took about 4 days to get any response from Tokyo on what the President's position was. What were the major considerations, and why didn't the President leap on this day one? I mean, the broad issue
Well, we
seems
had
so
to see
clear.
it. For one thing, we had to see it. For a second thing, we still don't have the numbers. The Joint Committee is not going to have the actual numbers runs. We're not even going to have a bill for another 3 or 4 days. The President wants to make sure that it's revenue neutral. He has a letter out to the leadership, House Republican leadership that promises certain things. He wanted to make sure it comports with that letter.
Could I just comment on one point, that as a former tax lawyer and investment analyst who's, I think, seen every tax shelter that's come along the pike, it seems to me the beneficial effects of having one tax rate are so great that they far outweigh any possible benefits from having 2 rates, a slightly lower rate for capital gains. And I hope that this version will stick. Also on the issue of the coherence of the administration, you referred in your comments to the President's favorite unread novel, which we've all read these days, David Stockman's book. And I'm wondering at what point you and the President and other senior people in the administration realized that the proposal for the increase in defense spending was not for the 5% real increase compounded, of which the President had spoken in the 1980 campaign, but for a 10% increase in real terms.
Well, I think there was some recognition of that in the 81-82 time frame. We spoke in the campaign about 5, then 7. I think it was there was some suggestion that it might have been as much in one of those budget years, and I can't remember which one. It might have been as much as 11 or 12. And I think there was a recognition of that. But there was a feeling on the President's part, and he consciously made this decision, that you couldn't judge it just by an expressed percentage, regardless of what he said in the campaign, that you had to look at what the threat was. And you had to judge it from a purely national security standpoint, and that's the standpoint from which he judged it.
But you're saying that what Stockman says is simply totally wrong and untrue, that there was no accident that boosted it from 5 to 10.
No. What I'm saying is I think there was a recognition internally, and I think his book says this, that there was a recognition that we were up above the 5 to 7, and I think the book says that.
Okay. In terms of the questions from the audience, let me explain the ground rules. We've come to hear Secretary Baker, not other people give speeches. Questions should be questions and limited to no more than 1 minute. And we will start here with microphone A.
Welcome to Massachusetts, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you.
First, the question I have for you actually deals with the fact that the Packwood Plan is the first plan that has really addressed comprehensive tax reform, looking at not only making a level playing field, although it might resemble the parquet floor of the garden in its quirks and foibles, but relatively level playing field, but also a strong enforcement component, a funding mechanism for the IRS that is separate from political considerations. Considering that we have a $100 billion tax gap and one that's widening, what will be the President's position on that enforcement component, especially the amnesty, which appears to be watered down in the Packwood bill and amounts to a continuous amnesty for anyone who sort of walks in the door, and pretty much business as usual for the IRS, when in fact what it seems to be necessary is a chance for people to clear the slates, and let's move to this new era where we're going to have significant tax reform and a brand new playing field on which to operate.
Well, there are a number of things involved in your question. One is on the issue of amnesty. We think amnesty works a little differently at the federal level than it does at the state level. We've never formally embraced an amnesty, federal amnesty, because we are really concerned that we will not be able to properly make the case to all honest taxpayers, and frankly there's a higher degree of compliance at the federal level than there is at the state level, that we're not going to be letting a lot of people off who've been cheating, and that we're not going to come back in 5 more years and have another amnesty, which would adversely affect compliance in the future. The savings, the dollar savings from that provision, come from the additional compliance measures that are called for, not from the amnesty. It comes from the additional revenue agents. It comes from the fact that there would be an off-budget accumulation of funds that would belong to the Internal Revenue Service. We've never embraced that as administration policy. We did not object when that provision was put into the bill in the middle of some very hectic and hurried negotiations. It does have a significant revenue component. For the most part, most administrations have opposed off-budget financing out of special pools, and the feeling that things ought to go through the general revenue, into the general revenue, so that priorities can be determined by the executive branch deliberative process. So I can't tell you whether or not we will take whether we'll take a formal administration position in favor of that provision. The amnesty portion of it, we are likely to have some problem with.
Let me see if this is Grady Hedgesmith. I should give you a warning. Who is a graduate of the school, who was an assistant commissioner of revenue here.
He has a very successful program here in the state of Massachusetts.
He may not be entirely neutral on the subject. Grady, one more question.
Just a quick follow-up to that. If the notion of tax reform is to give folks better confidence in their tax system, what better time than when you change the rules than to reinforce the behavior of those people who in fact are complying, make them know that their investment in government is being protected by the work and the effort of the IRS, but also make sure that you bring everybody into the fold at that time that you make the conversion, so that with computers and modern enforcement techniques and the like, you can give better assurance to the Joe average stiff who makes a W-2 statement every year and can't evade through tax shelters, that in fact their investment is being matched by those people who are a little bit better off and have been able to shelter money away and also evade taxes explicitly.
If you were going to move to a federal amnesty, there would probably not be a better time to do it than in the context of comprehensive tax reform, which is what you're saying, and I acknowledge that we have some problems with a federal amnesty that I think don't necessarily pertain to a state amnesty. And when the governor's conference came to the White House here this year, Governor Dukakis raised this issue with me, and we talked about it at some length, and you've had a very successful program here, and you're to be commended on it. Illinois has as well. The situation is a little bit different at the federal level, and then we've got this other problem of the off-budget financing that doesn't really square with the way the federal government is normally run.
Okay. Let's go to microphone B.
Yes, I'd like to turn the discussion back to your talk. It seems to me you counterposed what you call the technocratic values of the Carter administration with the values of what you see as a strong presidency, which at various points you appealed to its grandeur, its appeal to mysterious values. I'm wondering if you could address some of the shortcomings of this strong presidency. It seems to me that the president is very insulated from criticisms. The president can run up record deficits. 239 soldiers can be killed in Lebanon. Unlike Jimmy Carter, 52 hostages are returned safe and sound, and the press crucifies him. And I'm wondering if you could also maybe address your own role in producing what has been called the cocoon presidency of Ronald Reagan, being insulated from criticism. That comes out very clearly in Stockman's book, where Stockman wanted to be more candid with the American public, and you told him to take his pride and stick it up his ass. I'm wondering if you could...
At least that's what the book says.
Anyway, I'll let you answer the question.
Let me say that any president and any administration, I think, would seek to avoid criticism. They should, if they're doing their job right. But they won't be successful. And I don't think we've been any more successful in that regard, to be very honest with you, than prior administrations. It may not have stuck as well, and we've all heard the Teflon presidency characterization used with respect to this president. But I think that makes my point, and my point is simply this, that these macro qualities, if you will, of leadership and the ability to persuade, the ability to convince the American people that you know what you want, that you've got this inner compass on the big issues, and you know where you want to go, and you don't swing with each and every political wind that comes by and change your position. You are willing to compromise in order to get what you need in terms of a win, if you will, up on the hill. I think it's those kind of things. I don't know whether you were watching the evening news in the 81, 82 time frame, but when the economy was in some state of disrepair, I know I was watching it frequently at that time, and I can guarantee you we got our share of criticism, a lot of it.
Okay. Microphone C, up in the balcony.
Yes, I'd like to ask you a question about tax reform. It seems that the fundamental ideological reason for tax reform is to minimize the misallocation of resources and distortions to the free market, and thereby, in the long run, create wealth. But every time a new plan is brought to light, all the media can do is come out and say how many dollars somebody's going to gain or lose next year. Now, why don't you ask, or let me rephrase that, why hasn't Ronald Reagan used the office of the presidency and the media to go to the people and say that, why don't you consider your children in the long run?
The greater good, yeah. I think I understand let me see if I can explain it this way. Fundamental tax reform has been tried 3 or 4 times in the history of this country, and it's never been successfully accomplished because it is a very difficult undertaking, because you're hitting people in there and you're affecting them in their pocketbooks. When this proposal was first advanced back in May of 1985, when we first submitted the president's proposal, and he went around the country for about 2 to 2.5 weeks, we were beginning to see in the numbers some fairly significant support being built for tax reform. Then there was the TWA skyjacking, and the president quite properly turned his attention to that. And then there were a number of other issues, and we went into the legislative process on tax reform, which was a process of 2 to 3 months of hearings in the House, where every day or every week, each and every special interest who was going to be in any way affected came into the House and very forcefully argued that if we made that change, it was going to be the end of Western civilization as we know it. And the press dutifully covered that, because that's what they were saying. And therefore, all you got for 2 to 3 months were these negatives out there about this is how it was going to impact this group or that group. And whatever consensus there was in support of the overall good of tax reform evaporated. What didn't evaporate, and the reason I think the Packwood Committee was successful in ultimately coming up with a bill, and the reason I think now that we will hopefully ultimately get tax reform, is that there remains a genuine disrespect on the part of the American people for the tax code. They think it's unfair. They think their neighbor gets a better deal. They know that you got to have a Philadelphia lawyer to understand it, and they don't think it's right, and it isn't right, and they want it changed. And that disrespect for the tax code translates into disrespect for government generally. So it's important that we do change it. And the president, as I said in answer to this question, is going to be out there, and he's going to be out there full bore supporting this.
I can't see whether there is a microphone D tonight. I think there's not. So we're back here to microphone A.
Thank you. Mr. Baker, during your talk on the presidency, you spoke about the dominating impact of a president's perception and the importance that can have and the effect his administration will have in governing the nation. The present administration has a public perception problem with minorities, and it also has a public perception problem dealing with the poor. I wonder if you could perhaps suggest what the cause of the perception problem is. Is it all in substance, or is it something else? How does it concern the presidency, and what is this administration going to do to overcome the perception problem?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think that, and it's one that we have had to address frequently during the 4 years that I was in the White House, and I think that we continue to have to address. I think it's to some degree a function of the fact that the president's political philosophy, or philosophy of government, if you will, is that we need to shrink the size of the federal government. And we believe that, and we believe it very strongly. And we've made some progress in that regard. Not as much as we'd like, because only 27% of the federal budget is subject to the control of the chief executive. Much of our spending is just automatic as a consequence of entitlement programs. But I think the fact that we have made every effort to cut out programs, to make programs, to administer programs more effectively, to eliminate fraud, waste, and abuse, and believe me, there has been a lot of fraud, waste, and abuse in the administration of many very worthwhile programs. But I really honestly believe that there are not social safety net programs as such that we have eliminated. I mean, I would be delighted to know of one. We have cut back in some areas where we think cutbacks were justified. But I do not quarrel with your conclusion that we have a perception problem in these two areas. Indeed we do. We continue to have to address that.
Why don't a short follow-up?
Very, very short follow-up. Well, A, you didn't address the problem of perception among minorities.
Well, I think the two things are somewhat, when you're talking about cutting the budget, you see it in those two areas, the poor and minorities,
the programs, the social programs that go directly to the poor, make up a relatively small portion of the overall federal budget.
And I don't think that we have made major reductions in those programs. What we've done is cut the waste and the fraud and the abuse out of those programs. At least that's what we've tried to do.
Okay. We're back to microphone B.